Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the World War Now podcast. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. This is the first week in November here, 2022. Dmitry, how are you?
And we welcome you to the second last month of the tumultuous 2022. And I'm doing great, Conrad, myself. We have a lot of things to speak about, especially some of the religious aspects of the current geopolitical as well as metaphilosophical landscape. I think there's some great stuff we can touch upon on this episode. But I'm doing all right overall, very hyped.
I'm good. I'm good as well. I'm a little tired, but I think this is going to boost me some energy a little bit talking about some of this stuff. And this is going to be one of those episodes where there's not really going to be any other content like this on the internet, so strap in for that. But before we started recording, we were kind of talking about, are people going to start thinking that we just like talk about whatever's in the news and not just about our more niche thing of geopolitics? But in many ways, the arc of history is kind of bending towards us, and whether it's even something like Kanye West or what's going on in England or what's going on even in random parts of South America, like it you only have to read one or two articles before you hear something that me and Dimitri have been talking about for a long time at this point. So I think, not to just say we're vindicated all day, every day, but in many ways, the world is becoming more metapolitical, more metaphysical in this way. So it all seems relevant at times.
Yeah, I think today mainly we'll begin this podcast by just speaking about some of the religious background to what the future may hold, and I guess what we're going to mention primarily is an article by Father Joseph where he speaks about the prophecies relating to Russia and the future affairs of the world. And the prophecies, by prophecies we mean literally predictions by Christian saints, in particular, of course, Orthodox Christian saints, which speak about the future of not just world affairs but geopolitics, Russia, about how things will eventually, I guess, according to God's will, play out. If of course the state of the world remains in a certain disbalance, which it is right now. And I guess these prophecies, we'll see how they relate to reality, and of course some of these great events that are occurring at the moment, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine and other things around the world. So
Yeah, no, we have, midterms coming up in America, which I think a lot of us hope could be the beginning of an off-ramp to the US, adventure in funding the Ukrainian project. But we'll get to that in a little bit. And yeah, with we've talked about prophecies of Saint Lawrence before, of Chernigov, who's a great Ukrainian Russian saint. We've talked about the words of Metropolitan Neophytos, a living saint to this day, the words of his spiritual fathers, perhaps Saint Paisios and some others. But this piece by Father Joseph really brings out some of the most relevant, and as well as, you should read the whole article. We'll of course link it in the show notes on YouTube and Substack, but it also provides a lot of good context from him, and about the understanding of orthodoxy, of Antichrist, of nation, and these kinds of things. So it's a great resource. I recommend anyone who is even curious about Christianity and geopolitics and just Christian history to read it. But with all that being said, is there anyone in particular you want to start us off with first, Dimitri? We want to hear the words directly. We don't need paraphrases from us jokers.
yeah, I guess we'll begin in the particular Substack. Father Joseph begins with the prophecy of um, an Orthodox monk named Elder Porfyrios of Glinsk. Now, Elder Porfyrios passed away in 1868, so this is close to over 150 years ago, and this is essentially will be just reading Elder Porphyrios' words, and he writes, "In due course, faith will collapse in Russia, the brilliance of earthly glory will blind the mind, the word of truth will be defiled, but with regard to the faith, some from among the people, unknown to the world, will come forward and restore what was scorned." So that's the citation. Of course, as in all Orthodox tradition, even going back to the Old Testament, a lot of the written word was of course taken down from the verbal tradition passed on through generations. So of course Elder Porphyrios probably did not write this prophecy himself. It's most likely he passed it on to his monastic disciples and apprentices who wrote it down for him. It's similar in a way to how Saint John the theologian, the apostle of Christ, wrote down the apocalypse on the island of Patmos, and his the saint sitting next to him, listening to his words, listening to the prophecy, wrote down the book of Revelations, what we would call the Apocalypse. So Elder Porphyrios' prophecy, essentially, we can say it's just a couple sentences, but it speaks about the fact that faith will collapse in Russia, and this is him writing in the 1800s, which Russia at the time, the Russian Empire, was a very orthodox, a hugely successful orthodox imperial, like about imperial superpower, essentially. It wasn't as economically mighty or militarily mighty as the British Empire, but in terms of influence over the world, it was doing evangelical work. It had the faith of the Orthodox people was spreading throughout the world. It was a huge source of missionary zeal. It was also, I guess, an economic superpower which was growing to like exponentially throughout time, and it was the first time in any country in human history that the population, Orthodox people, was that large in one particular place. So the fact that Elder Porfyrios in the 1800s would say something like, well, the faith will collapse in Russia, it is quite a dire prediction. And even Russian bishops and priests at the time would probably not listen to Elder Porfyrios. They would say, look, this man is crazy. Like, what is he? With all due respect, like, he is a monk, but what he's saying is absurd. How can faith collapse in the place where it's strongest at the moment? Look how powerful we are. Look how much gold our churches have. Look how much laity we have coming to church. But little did they know, in 50 years' time, the devil will strike his mark, and of course the Russian people did falter in the time of tribulation during World War One, and of course the revolution, and things did collapse in Russia. But the second part of the prophecy, of course, speaks about the fact that the word of truth was defiled, so the Orthodox faith was attacked by firstly the Bolsheviks, the communists, but again, even these days, the Orthodox faith, not just in Russia but abroad as well, is being attacked by liberalism, this new scourge. And so the word of truth will be defiled, but according to the faith, from among the people, so essentially what he's saying is, from unknown places, these Orthodox people will rise up, these good Christians, and restore what was scorned. I mean, that's quite a decent prediction, wouldn't you say, Connor? The fact that there's this, I guess, second part saying that by God's will, people will restore what was lost. I mean, that's sort of like a return, almost traditionalist, kind of statement at the end there.
Well, yeah, and it fits into, in many ways, they would have in no way the context to understand what we know now. And looking back, in many ways, we see while the Soviet yoke was brutal, especially at specific decades and periods of time, in many ways, it was able to, because of the existence of the catacomb church, in many ways, it was able to protect the soil, the true essence of the Russian nation from the modern spirit, from liberalism, from what we see now, kind of the specter that's taken over, that's at least trying to take over the whole world. And that's not to say that communism wasn't something similar, but it ultimately would pass on and was almost a literal, a harsh, sharp iron, painful curtain that still, perhaps in the grand scheme of things, was, as they say, persecution and martyrdom. We should be grateful to those things for God. In many ways that idea was proven in perhaps the 20th century for Russia. And again, like you said, people would have thought Elder Porphyrios was crazy. Like, this is the time of Alexander III. People have already lived through the reign of Paul I. Like, these are people that the church is considering canonizing. Like, these are just giants of Christian government. Like, these are rulers of the stature of Byzantine emperors. And to say these kinds of things would be shocking, for sure.
Yeah, I think especially when things are going really well, it's a little bit hard to kind of and I guess in the Old Testament we do see that. We do see prophets attending the courts of the kings of Judea and Israel, and kind of describing this is what will happen in the I'm sure there's other parts, not just to the prophecy, but there's explanation as to why Elder Porphyrios said such, I guess, gave such powerful clairvoyant statements to his flock. Like, there is a reason behind it. Orthodox clairvoyance and prophecy. Notice that in the Orthodox faith, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but in the Orthodox tradition, we believe that Saint John the Baptist, Saint John the Forerunner, was the last prophet, and after him, of course, he baptized Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and that Old Testament line of prophecy, we have these powerful prophets, these incredible saints, that kind of ends. Of course, Saint John the Evangelist, Saint John the Apostle, was another sort of figure with a similar prophetic gift, and the one who looked after, was the caretaker of the Theotokos and wrote the Book of Revelations, and his letters and the fourth gospel, which many people venerate very greatly. So the fourth gospel of John, which begins with the words, about the word of God and God, Jesus Christ being the Logos. I mean, these are very foundational sort of things. Even in today's conservative thought, you see Jordan Peterson bring up the fact, he's speaking about the Logos, and it's all a reference to St. John's Gospel. Now, I think it's important just to understand that things are going very well, and in the Orthodox tradition, prophets there's no more designated prophets in the church, or in that there aren't any saints which are given the title of prophet anymore, but the gift of clairvoyance and prophecy is still around, because that is one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit being, God being still active in the world, gifts to some of his people for it's essentially for the benefit of, I guess, the church overall, and not just the church, but I guess everyone around, and maybe even to bring people into the church. It gives them these gifts of clairvoyance, and at times they speak about things which may come, or things which most likely will occur. By saying most likely is that nothing in the future is set in stone, because the Old Testament teaches us as well as the New Testament and the lives of saints. They do teach us that the behavior of the people living in the future will, of course, sometimes sway the mercy of God. God will be merciful and maybe not exact certain judgments on his people in the earthly realm. Wouldn't you say, Conrad? Like, we see the same in, I guess, the modern world, which is why at the Divine Liturgy in Orthodox churches, we pray, we ask, have mercy on us, O Lord. We actually actively ask for mercy so that certain events do not transpire, which we most likely deserve, but probably we're hoping that, that God has mercy on us and gives us maybe
Yeah.
a softer test. Yeah.
No, exactly. And in many ways, I think I've plugged this video before, but everyone needs to watch Metropolitan Neophytos video on Uncreated Light Press YouTube channel about the power. It's called The Power to Change Prophecy. And he speaks about, because he's gotten criticism from the secular media in Cyprus about, like, who's this crazy bishop talking about war prophecies and World War III and the vaccines and all these kinds of things. But at the end, and people might think, like, this is just going to rile up people with fear. This is just going to scare people, make them think about this kind of thing. But no, when you understand that, in many ways, Metropolitan Neophytos is speaking to the people immediately in the room at times when he says things, as well as he admits through the technology of the world, people around the world. When prayerful people hear things like that, their response isn't fear and freaking out. Their response is prayer. And I struggle with that as much as the next person, but I know there are people out there that their response is prayer, and they are prayer warriors, and they are people who, when they fear for the possible health and well-being of their neighbor and their church and their community and people around the world, they will be praying day and night and prostrating and saying the Jesus prayer and asking for mercy. And this is how we engage in spiritual warfare. And so then a living saint, someone like Metropolitan Neophytos, who is given this gift of the Holy Spirit, because in many ways we're all prophets. After Pentecost, in many ways we're all prophets, because by revelation we can all open the scriptures and see and know and proclaim that Jesus Christ will return, and every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And everyone has that ability. Everyone has the power to proclaim those words because it's the truth. But just in the same way that, sin and participation in sin and turning away from God, provide harrowing circumstances in your day-to-day life. Those who do the opposite and are always imbibing in the Holy Spirit and are truly working out their salvation with fear and trembling and are co-workers with God, they are given the foretaste, of things to come, which is these gifts of clairvoyance, which is just a glimpse of what time perhaps could be perceived as in the eschaton, in our divinized bodies and these kinds of things. So this is a very biblical and very we live in biblical times. I would go so far as to say that. And to keep going with some of these prophecies, though, so we don't spend too much. We want to make sure that you hear that in many ways this was something that the saints of Russia were really almost in unison about. And we have Archimandrite Jonah, Archimandrite being a priest monk. He says in 1902. You will see what will happen in 50 years' time. Everyone will forsake the law of God and will fall away from the faith, but then they will again come to their senses and turn back and live in a Christian manner. And that's very similar to what Elder Porfyrios said.
Yeah, I think it's noteworthy. Notice we're reading out some of these titles. So Archimandrite Jonah, very high level title in, of course, the Russian church, but can you just imagine the privilege we have these days? Not taking anything away from the venerable Archimandrite Jonah, but we have the privilege of having a metropolitan such as Neophytos of Morpha. Metropolitan is a much higher rank, not just in the Greek church, but in the Russian. There are only, I believe, up to, I think, just maybe over between 50 and 100 metropolitans in the entire world. This is, 7 billion people almost, right? So a metropolitan is a very high title in the church, and we have a metropolitan openly, almost clairvoyantly speaking to not just Orthodox people, but to the entire world, warning them of the events to come and that they should turn to Christ. And here, even, like, this is, so God is sending us some of his highest, most respected leaders to kind of proclaim his word and to give these warnings about what the future will hold. And of course, we're referencing Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu's clairvoyant statements at the beginning of the COVID pandemic in March, and I think it was April. No, it was even prior to that, right? It was January, February 2020. So,
Oh, it was
yeah.
February 2020, as well as his words in the past just 5 years about Ukraine and about war and about, with Russia. He's spoken very openly about all of these things.
Yeah.
And again, he's the spiritual child of three saints of our time. Saint Paisios, probably the most well known for his prophetic clairvoyance, is very, very well known for that. And so it's like, yeah, like Dimitri
Mm.
said, having bishops, and it's truly the wheat is being separated from the tares. And we talk about how in many, like Metropolitan Neophytos, it's very important that has this saintly succession behind him. And reading the prophecies of these pre-revolutionary Russian saints, it helps you understand how the saints and the martyrs were able to endure, because they understood that they were coming from a lineage of other saints, and they knew that that cloud of witnesses in heaven above them was praying them on, and that those people had given them these words and these of comfort. Imagine having heard this.
Mhm.
This is the kind of thing that gives someone the power to endure torturous, torturous martyrdom for Christ, because the Holy Spirit gifted them with holy elders and holy words, and trust that, like, to strengthen their faith. That's what, like, people read, like, in accounts of martyrs and even the scriptures, and God strengthened their faith. Like, sure, the specifics aren't mentioned because they perhaps might not be relevant to us now, but what we don't know exactly, like strengthening their faith in all sorts of supernatural ways, and this is
Mhm.
one of those ways.
Yeah, I think, and even in a very worldly sense, just the fact that notice some of these prophecies, they're like they predict something dire to occur. In this case, both Archimandrite Jonah and Elder Porfyrios, they both speak about an event that will come, which is the Russian Revolution. In our time, of course, the Russian Revolution was 100 years ago. We know the tragic outcomes of that and the Civil War, and of course the other tragedies of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. But for notice how these elders of the church, they also mention in the second half of their prophecies that, look, there will be a comeback. There'll be a return to people will live in a Christian manner. Just quoting Archimandrite Jonah. And the one thing I wanted to mention, Conrad, was also the fact that I didn't mention in the first segment, but Metropolitan Neophytos of Morpha, the fact that we live in such, I guess, it is almost like a World War now state where the world is all not globalized, it's all very tense and hot, and an actual metropolitan, so a bishop of very high rank, needs to come to us to tell us about these dire events, as opposed to just a simple humble elder from a monastery. And it's almost as if things are escalating to the point where we know at the end of the world, and I'm not saying we're there yet, but in the end times, of course, according to Orthodox Christian tradition, when the Antichrist from the tribe of Dan will rule in Israel, okay? So the Antichrist will rule in Israel. God will send down, of course, his two witnesses to come proclaim the word of God to the various pagan or Orthodox Jewish tribes. For example, the prophet Elijah will return, and the forefather Enoch as well will be a prophet who will return to
Mm-hmm.
teach the pagan peoples. Notice, so right before the world ends, God sends his literal, like, the trump cards, like the biggest people from world history will emerge, and even they in some way will fail to, I guess, not fail, but I guess people will not take their word, just like they didn't listen to St. John the Baptist in his time, this greatest of prophets, St. John the Baptist. So God sends us higher
Not
ranking
everyone even
officials.
listened to God himself.
Well,
Not everyone even
absolutely.
listened to Christ
So
himself. So
it's
of
in a way it's
course
a little bit
there'll
scary
always
because
be.
Yeah, that's right. You have a literal metropolitan of the Greek Church is telling you things, and people are still doubting him, sticking to their liberal presuppositions, saying, "Well, he must be senile, or maybe maybe he's in prelist, or maybe he's." People are saying really absurd things about a high-ranking bishop. It's not like back in the Russian days where you had like, you'd go to a monastery and a venerable, humble monk will maybe give you a clairvoyant statement about the future. No, we have literal bishops with a microphone telling us directly what the future will hold, and people are still doubting it. So, I mean, I'm not surprised that God, in the end, will send the prophet Elijah himself to us, and Enoch. Yeah.
I mean, the spirit of this world is so strong that people would like people are so afraid of looking silly or looking like they're unwise to the world, as people would say. But we're supposed to be unwise. Like we're supposed to look foolish to this world in many ways. And it like again, many people even thought at the time that Saint Paisios was Elijah, and he explicitly denounced this, obviously. But I think it's safe to say that we're perhaps seeing that mode enter into our church life and perhaps preparing us, those at least who perhaps have ears to hear, to eventually then hear those words. And I have no idea how long that will be. But I mean, just think about it. I mean, Metropolitan Neophytos himself, he is a metropolitan in the archdiocese of Morphu, Metropolia of Morphu rather, on Cyprus. Half of that is occupied by the Ottoman Empire. Turkey, half of it is still, occupied by an occupying Muslim force. His name is Neophytos, which means the new. I mean, there's all like these are all sorts of interesting things to think about. And a neophyte is someone new towards something. And Cyprus is the island of the Apostle Barnabas. I mean, it's one of the oldest apostolic sees, actually, after the apostolic sees themselves of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. Cyprus was founded by the Apostle Barnabas himself, and like this is to not be paying attention to, I guess, what the Christian leaders there are saying would be foolish for anybody. But do you want to perhaps hit us with some of these next ones, Dimitri, and
Yeah, I
maybe
think
maybe say something about that, but then we'll move on.
no, yeah, I think it's really, I think, important to pay attention to the words of our bishops, especially those who have proven time and time again to be, proper leaders of the faith and who have an active role in, I suppose, defending the Orthodox faith. Metropolitan Neophytos is not just someone who comes out every now and then and gives a statement. No, he actually not only leads his people in his local diocese, but he also defends the faith in apologetic terms against Catholics, against certain zealous Muslims, etc., etc. So he's actually, his work, it goes beyond just making viral statements which become popular online. So don't be mistaken here. He's, in terms of, if anyone listens and says, well, this must be someone who's just doing things for clout, maybe like an Andrew Tate, like making statements which will go viral. No. These Orthodox clairvoyant statements, this is of a different level, of course. And the next saint, speaking about clout and fame, Saint John of Kronstadt, and his prophecy, I'm just going to read it out. I foresee the restoration of a powerful Russia, still stronger and mightier than before. On the bones of these martyrs, remember, as on the strong foundation, will the new Russia be built, according to the old model, strong in her faith in Christ God and in the Holy Trinity. And there will be, in accordance with the covenant of the Holy Prince Vladimir, a single church. Russian people have ceased to understand what Rus is. It is the footstool of the Lord's throne. The Russian person must understand this and thank God that he is Russian. I mean, okay, that's the prophecy. I mean, what jumps out at you, Conrad, at first glance here? Because I mean, I could probably speak about this for about half an hour, but there's a lot to discuss, definitely.
I mean, besides the stuff that has indisputably already happened, of course, the bones of the martyrs, and we've discussed this extensively on the show. I think the most obvious, interesting one is, and there will be, in accordance with the covenant of the Holy Prince Vladimir, a single church, which says to me nothing more than the Ukrainian schism will end in our lifetime.
Yeah,
That's what I think, at least.
absolutely. Notice how during St. John's time there was no schism in the Russian Church. It's very interesting that the Russian Church essentially was united. Of course, the Russian Church, people need to understand, it's called the Church of Russia. This is what we're speaking about, the local Orthodox jurisdiction of, I mean, called the Church of Moscow, the Russian Church. Now, that church is not just for Russians. It's actually very multicultural. It has Japanese people, it has Mongolians, Chinese, Uzbekistani, Kazakhstani people, all the various tribesmen of Russia, Siberia, Alaska. I mean, even Americans at one point, before the American church gained its independence, was also under I guess under the armophore of the Russian Church. And so the Russian
I mean,
Church,
I'm in the
yeah.
Antiochian Church with Saint Raphael of Brooklyn is like kind of considered our main guy. He was under the patronage of Tsar Nicholas II, and he was an Arab speaker.
Yeah, so we have even Middle Easterners as members of the Russian Church is simply an administrative jurisdiction, but yes, it does cater primarily to the tripartite Russian speaking peoples, which is why the language which they use is Church Slavonic at the Divine Liturgy. And what are these tripartite? What is this like triune conglomeration here? Well, we're speaking about the Russians, or what they call the ethnic group is the Great Russians, which live on the main Russian mainland, I suppose, surrounding Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novgorod, and those areas. And then you have, of course, the Belarusians, which live close to the Baltic in the west, and the Malorussians. And of course, I'd add there's probably a lot more variance there, but the Malorussian people, as or today, what they're called, Ukrainians, especially. So we have these triune peoples all united under one church, and more than that, we have people from China, also members of the Russian Church, etc., etc. So notice Saint John, he mentions the church will be one single whole. The schisms will finish; they will end, at least, of course, for a time, hopefully. But at the moment, we don't really see that, do we? But so it's probably a prophecy, and not even about the Soviet times when the church was repressed to the point of the Orthodox Church was in survival mode essentially, especially in the Russian mainland and the Soviet Union. Now we're going to see an unlocking, I guess, kind of a looking forward towards what he's speaking about. He mentions Holy Prince Vladimir, which is, of course, the baptizer of Rus, the great prince who was living in Kiev, who, I guess, baptized all of Russia, took on the faith from the Orthodox Greeks. Like, this imagery is being brought up in geopolitics in the Russian-Ukrainian war right now. Ukrainians are claiming that Saint Vladimir is some sort of Ukrainian forefather, but Saint Vladimir, first and foremost, was a great Orthodox saint, firstly. And of course, he was also from an ancient Russian dynasty, and Russian back then, it meant not just specifically Great Russian, but Ukrainians and Russians were one people. We have one ancestry. We weren't divided, even not even culturally back then. It was one entire sort of ethnic unity. Yes, diverse in certain areas, but again, united by these great saints and leaders.
Oh, exactly. And even in the Russian church, there are even places for, Anglo-Germans like me. I mean, Tsarina Alexandra, she was an English aficionado of German heritage, and she's today a great empress, confessor, martyr of our church. And I was going to read the next one from Elder Aristocles of Moscow from 1918, which this one gets a little esoteric. He says, "An evil will shortly take Russia, and wherever this evil goes, rivers of blood will flow. It is not the Russian soul, but an imposition on the Russian soul. It is not an ideology nor a philosophy, but a spirit from hell. In the last days, Germany will be divided. France will be just nothing. Italy will be judged by natural disasters. Britain will lose her empire and all her colonies, and will come to almost total ruin, but will be saved by praying enthroned women. America will feed the world, but will finally collapse." So I want to hear your thoughts on some of that. Dimitri, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot, of course, a lot is kind of shrouded from our eyes. I mean, for example, when he mentions praying in friend women, like, who exactly is he speaking about here? Like, is he speaking about, Queen Elizabeth II, or is there somebody else who, isn't yet revealed to us, or what exactly is happening? Not too sure. But Elder Aristocles of Moscow, notice he does mention, of course, again, he's prophesying about the fall of Russia and the evil that took over Russia, the Bolsheviks, the communists. Yes, that is confirmed. That has already occurred, and him essentially clairvoyantly telling us that that will happen is, of course, a great, a great sort of evidence, I guess, of the actions of the Holy Spirit of God in the world, at least back then and today as well. Now, notice, now he mentions the fact that this ideology, a spirit from hell, will also take over Russia. I feel like today a certain other spirit has taken over the world. Now, this spirit is definitely different to that of the communists, and even though modern libs, they do call themselves Marxists and followers of Marx, but their ideology is very different from the Leninist, Trotskyist ideals that were pushed back in the early 1920s. This is what we see today is definitely an ideology from hell. There's even like memes going around that look, we're descending into a certain like hell world in terms of people abusing children, etc., spreading degenerate ideologies. Even money is completely not worth anything. Even notice Christ's words, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's." But Caesar's like even the term, like even talents and denaries don't even apply anymore because we have fiat currency and essentially everything's a shitcoin. Forgive my French, but everything essentially is equivalent to a cryptocurrency. Money has no gold backing it, so even these biblical ideas of gold and money being equivalent, that doesn't apply anymore. We're working in an artificial, like, mark of the beast type, almost mark of the beast type system. It's really really unhinged, right? And notice how he mentions, of course, France, Italy, Britain, all these countries, Germany, today are essentially colonies of the United States. Elder Aristocles does not mention America, does not mention, and of course, I don't mean America as a sort of collective of people, but America as the global American empire, the GAE. So the GAE running these affairs in Europe, all of these countries, aforementioned here, are all members of NATO. They're all enslaved by this, I guess, ideology, and they're willing participants. Then it's not just that they're enslaved, from the outside. No, they're actually willingly participating in this European Union, NATO-esque globalist agenda. And yeah, here we are. We're kind of eating the fruits of that, and of course, we're noticing in the Ukraine kind of wants to join into that theater of whatever degenerate circus is happening at the moment. So
No, and you talk about America. I mean, some of this I think you argue is happening right now. I mean, he says America will feed the world, but will finally collapse. Like, what's happening right now? If it wasn't for American, propping up of the current Western European countries, they would have already come to the negotiating table with Russia. Like they're and we know that it's eventually going to get to the point where it's going to be out of necessity, not out of just desire to keep those countries in line. And this is complete speculation, so yeah, no one quote me on this on anything serious. But when it comes to what the praying enthroned women could mean, I mean, I was just mentioning Empress Alexandra, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the royal martyrs, the Grand Duchesses Tsar Nicholas and Empress Alexandra's children. I mean, those could be the enthroned women praying for England. I mean, they're daughters of England in some sense. I mean, they were close there, and at this time they were still alive when Elder Aristocles said this, and it wouldn't be until 2000 that they would be glorified by the church. So that could very well be what they were
yeah,
talking about.
and like the Russian Empire was very close to the British Empire in terms of not just familiar relations, but the high British imperial culture was very much appreciated in Russia, even amongst Orthodox folks. Like, for example, Saint Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, after dinner, him and his children, he would read to his kids in the lounge room. He'd read them Sherlock Holmes, written by Arthur Conan Doyle. So the last Russian emperor, an Orthodox Christian, right, the Catechon, would read Sherlock Holmes to his kids, right? This is like it's one of the greatest, I guess, modern pieces of literature, like a detective book written in English. And of course, his children understood the English language. So the English language is a global language for a reason, and even the last Russian emperor spoke it fluently. And of course, his wife did too. And his wife was I think, the great granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So exactly as you said, Conrad, this reference to the enthroned women could of course mention the Russian nobility, which was very closely related to the British royal house.
Exactly. And I just want to say, this is a bit of a backtrack, but I just wanted to mention, you talked about Metropolitan Neophytos and how he's not just, making videos for clout and talking about these kinds of things, much like these elders, that wouldn't even be a thought because they were telling this to, one monk probably in a cell. But when it comes to that kind of thing, I mean, St. Porphyrios, in his Metropolitan Neophytos, says this in his interview with Father Peter Hears. St. Porphyrios told Metropolitan Neophytos that technology of the times that you don't even understand yet will be how your words are heard in Australia, in America, in Europe, in all around the world. And that's happening. I mean, Metropolitan Neophytos has, for better, he's been on the radio, he's been on YouTube, and he's an old Greek bishop, not super old, but he's a old Greek bishop. I don't think he's super technologically versed, but his monks help him, and he's able to be obedient to his elder Saint Porphyrios and have those words broadcast around the world, much like the Roman road system, which no one would say the Roman Empire is in itself virtuous at the time, but its road system allowed the gospel to be spread. And like Dimitri just said, the English language, I would say in many ways it's a tragedy that the English language has become what it is, because as an English speaker, I almost don't even have to learn foreign languages, but the English language as lingua franca, I could see that easily having implications that could help spread the gospel, and having everyone be able to understand this language that for better or for worse, there are more Orthodox words in English than, perhaps in Khmer or Swahili and some of these other languages. So having that, again, perhaps a thing that it is of itself is not good, is then used for something beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's important just to understand never to, at least, always approach things with discernment, and don't. It's important for like not just the listener, but try not to make very strong judgmental stances over things which may be neutral in the world, because of course humans are all fallible and humans always make mistakes, and just because the British Empire did participate in a lot of evil, and by evil I don't mean essentially the colonialism and the imperialism, which is definitely a factor, but I'm speaking more about the cultural impacts which it may have had. Like, it does not mean that it did not have positive effects on the world, and somehow did not play into God's plan for what the future will hold, of course, for the positive side and in serving the church, of course. And I guess we remember great English clergymen such as Metropolitan Callistus Ware, who passed away this year. So these people, like, even though some of their books are criticized, but some of these books, for example, like The Orthodox Way, was quite, especially some of my friends who came to the faith, they really appreciated these works of, I guess, an introductory book about Orthodox Christianity, which brought a lot of clarity to the English speaking people who've read it. And now, just moving on, this next prophecy, we've actually spoken about Saint Seraphim of Vyritsa a couple times over the podcast, but Saint Seraphim of Vyritsa, he's not Saint Seraphim of Sarov. This is a saint who lived 100 years after Saint Seraphim of Sarov, but he had very similar. I guess he lived in northern Ukraine, so northern Ukraine / Belarus, like right on the border in Vyritsa. So if you can geographically imagine it, that land was almost immediately conquered by Nazi Germany after Plan Barbarossa came into effect in July 1941, when I guess the Nazi Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So Saint Seraphim lived actually for 4 years under Nazi occupation, and this is when most of his prophecies came to be. And he passed away in 1949. So you can imagine he lived essentially his, I guess, his elder life under Stalin from the 1920s until the 19. Like, he didn't Stalin died in 53. Saint Seraphim died in 49. So, but Saint Seraphim, his prophecies are incredibly powerful. He's not a very well-known saint, even though his asceticism is quite astounding. The things which he did in his life, as well as, of course, living under Nazi occupation, still trying to serve the liturgy, things like that. He went through a lot of difficulty, and his prophecies are very striking because they're just besides the one I'm reading now, there's a few more of them, but he basically just kind of says it how it is, and yeah, it's just very, very powerful. I think Russians especially try to like take this stuff very seriously. But of course, let me just read the prophecy without further ado. The storm will pass over the Russian land. The Lord will forgive the Russian people their sins, and in the divine and holy beauty, the cross will shine brightly above the Church of Christ once more. And the ringing of bells will awaken all our holy roofs to salvation from the slumber of sin. Holy monasteries will open anew, and faith in God will unite all. The salvation of the world is from Russia. Like, really powerful final statement there. Essentially, he's claiming, well, Saint Seraphim, through his clairvoyance, God is telling us that Russia will be an engine, a tool of God to provide missionary work and spread orthodoxy around the world. I think like that's nothing short of the truth, at least at this point. Maybe not at the moment, because Russia's a little bit preoccupied, but in the future, I think we will see Russia as a shining example of something great that God will use.
Well, and speaking of seraphims, what did Father Seraphim Rose say? That, I mean, in the early 20th century, in the 40s and 50s, he believed, even then, he was like, oh, there will be a new czar in Russia. Like, not just, a figurative czar, perhaps like some people call, what that Putin is embodying, that idea, but like a real czar. And again, I have no predictions on when that will happen exactly, but that's what someone else who comes after this, very much this tradition in America, who opened a holy monastery in America, and who wrote so many of these works and things against, modern deceptions of our time, like signs in the sky and UFOs and charismaticism and all these sorts of things. And seeing him, like, he's not a son of Russia himself, but he's a son of the Russian Church, and in fact, I believe a fellow Anglo like me in America who was able to return home to truth.
Yeah, I think it's important to just understand that, notice how the Orthodox Church is so it's just so organic, and it naturally not only empowers the nation in which it's active. For example, the Russian nation, the Ukrainian nation, the Belarusians. The Orthodox Church empowers the people, and those who are members of it, their own culture is enhanced and their own nation benefits. For example, like, okay, well, when the Russian Church came to the rescue of the Georgian Church in the 1800s, so this is right before the Napoleonic Wars occurred, Georgia asked to join Russia, as in, like, to become a member of Russia, of the Russian Empire, and the Georgian princes signed an agreement with the Russian Emperor to join all their lands. Oh, this is not American Georgia, the state, but we're talking about Georgia in the Caucasus. So Georgia and the Caucasus, all those princedoms joined the Russian Empire and became, I guess, a member of it. They were annexed officially. Now, what's interesting is the Georgian population, and this is very interesting because modern Georgians notice how they really dislike Russia for various political reasons. But historically, Georgians between 1800 and the beginning of World War One, their population, I believe it either tripled or quadrupled demographically. So, and the Russian Church aided the Georgian Church a lot in terms of, like, reinforcing Orthodox faith, which was in many ways fallen. The Georgian people were in great despair. Even their saints, like, the level of sainthood fell greatly in the last 50 years prior to this in Georgia. Like, there were, like, almost no saints. The bishops were, basically running farmlands. The whole country was a mess, and the Russian Empire essentially came in with its clergy, assisted the Georgian Church, and look, the Orthodox Church, and notice the Georgian language and culture wasn't extinguished either. So this little local populace, Russia could have easily assimilated it and, completely destroyed Georgian autonomy, and the Georgian ethnos would have disappeared. But the Orthodox faith is not a racist one, nor is it an entirely modernist cosmopolitan one either. It kind of preserves while at the same time enhancing, but it's like a unity, but there is still distinction. It's very theological, frankly. Wouldn't you agree, Conrad? Like, I'm noticing.
Well, look, if you're
Yeah.
not able to look, the essence energies distinction is the only way to truly comprehend unity and multiplicity within the Godhead and the Triad, in the same way that it's the only, in the same way that level of understanding and nuanced revelation is going to affect how we view really hard civilizational questions like race and language and things like that.
Mm.
And I think the evidence of that is in many ways, people talk about how the world isn't going to be able to end until the gospel is preached at all four corners of the world. And we believe part of why the world hasn't ended yet is because while orthodoxy has been a bit slower in getting to places like South America and, the South Pacific and some of these places where Roman Catholicism already is, we believe that is part of why the world hasn't quite, ended yet, because some of these places still need to hear the word of the true church.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna, in regards to multiplicity and but at the same time not actually, I guess the I'll just read a quote from Saint Lawrence of Chernigov now, which I think it's a very powerful quote. I've tweeted it a couple times, and every time I've tweeted it, this is a real quote from him. It does trigger a lot of hatred, especially from the NATO folks, from the pro-Ukrainian, from the libs, the commies. They really hate this quote. So Saint Lawrence takes it upon himself to say the following words. He says, "As it is impossible to divide the most holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, for it is one God, so it is impossible to divide Russia, the Ukraine, and Belarus, for these together are holy Rus. Know this, remember this, and do not forget." That's the quote. It's like very straightforward. Again, notice there's a certain diversity there between the three, but at the same time they are one, united. And of course, it's a very powerful analogy comparing the Russian, I guess, culture to the Holy Trinity. Very, I guess, very strongly spoken, especially in Saint Lawrence's time. It's probably like a last resort in terms of which analogy you want to make. But in Saint Lawrence's time, this is when the Ukraine was officially, becoming annexed, and Khrushchev was, I think, connecting Crimea to Ukraine. So it was a really tumultuous time because the Soviets actually pushed the idea of an independent Ukraine. I guess they really promoted it, not independent in terms of like a geographical and statehood sense, but in terms of a cultural distinction. They really tried to emphasize that. And St. Lawrence kind of powerfully stated here, there will be no schisms. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus need to be united, not just in a religious and a church sense, in an administrative sense, but in a cultural sense. But notice how he doesn't say, well, Ukrainian culture must be wiped out, Belarusian culture must be wiped out. No, it's he's just saying that they're united, but let's face the reality. All three of these are holy Rus. And just as in the Georgian example, Russia and Georgia were united for about 100 years. The Georgian population tripled or quadrupled in the empire. This is like, you can read about this, this is incredible growth. Okay, then this is not even crazy technological innovations. Probably didn't even reach the Caucasus. Let's be honest here. In those 100 years, but the population literally tripled, quadrupled, and the Georgian culture was not wiped out under the protection of Russia. So we have essentially an ethnic minority surviving and thriving under the alongside a larger ethnic minority which is also thriving and surviving. So I think these are really good things to keep in mind, especially for folks in the right wing and in the, I guess, members of the base department on Twitter, that the Orthodox faith, it accommodates the nationalisms of all sorts, but you need to keep in mind we're coming at this not from a materialistic perspective, but firstly a spiritual one.
Exactly. And these people might be scandalized by those kinds of things, but frankly, the scriptures say that all the nations will bow, will come before Christ. The identifier of you as your nation is a way that Jesus Christ sees you, not so like people think that borders and ethnicity is fake. No, Jesus thinks it's real. So let's, let's kind of stop with these silly academic, post World War II nonsense games. But I was just going to say before we move on to some other, I'll let you say what you have to say too, but we want to move on to some more words of St. Lawrence, which somehow are going to get even more, contentious and controversial and everything. And we're also going to circle it back to Georgia a little bit as well. I just wanted to read before we get too far away from Father Seraphim Rose that very recently, Metropolitan Nicholas of Georgia, a very well-respected bishop of the Georgian Church, came to America and said, "All the leaders of my country have great veneration for these two men," meaning Father Seraphim Rose and Brother Jose Munoz, who was murdered in Greece on Halloween by Satanists. He says, "All the leaders of my country have great veneration for these two men. Our church, the Georgian Orthodox Church, has made a decision not to canonize these two individuals because we are waiting for the canonization of these two men by the church of which they belong to." He says he feels it is his duty to travel to various local Orthodox churches and speak out in favor of the canonization of a very important righteous monk. He's talking about Father Seraphim. "And I will say that my diocese, who he is the head of, each diocese is like a local church. I have the rights to popularize the lives and deaths of saints and venerate them. And in my diocese, these two men, Father Seraphim Rose and Brother Jose, are venerated as saints." He said that last month. And just, to make sure that we talk about Georgia and everything, in many ways, Georgia, while they do have some problems with interacting with the GAE, their church has done a very good job of preserving what I consider the true ecumenical Orthodox tradition, like the true pan-Orthodox tradition, where they do a very good job of venerating Russian saints, of venerating Serbian saints, and they venerate American saints perhaps even better than some Americans do. So, seeing Georgia preserved in that way, I think that we have, after Dimitri reads some more from St. Lawrence, I've got a bit from St. Gabriel of Georgia to say that will kind of tie all this together.
Very well said. I think absolutely those great saints in Georgia, even if locally they start becoming venerated, it's just a matter of time before that veneration spreads across the world, and hopefully the Russian Church outside of Russia, Rokor, will of course, kind of spearhead the canonization process, and we can all venerate them in our churches with icons, and it'll be great celebration, I think, in the 21st century when these saints are made official. Now, if you want to read about, say, Saint Seraphim Rose, or the future Saint Joseph, actually probably one of the first South American saints as well, Saint Jose, right? So his name in baptism was Joseph. He was a South American. Now, I'm not going to go into his life, but if you'd want to read more about him, you could follow us at @WorldWarNow _ Twitter, or at Orthodox Canonist, or at Nomrad, and on Twitter, and just follow. We do write about these great people, and sometimes it's even harder to, I guess, in a podcast setting, we'll need to release some special episodes just literally focusing on their lives, because they're just it's hard to even fit them in a short segment such as this one. There really is a lot of fruitfulness in terms of reading about these great saints, and even in a place such as Twitter. But of course, you can do your own research. Just to read about Jose Munoz of Rokor, I think it's very important to sort of appreciate these future saints in the church. Now, Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, we spoke about him plenty of times throughout most of the episodes. Now, his prophecies are, I guess, the last jewel in this crown at the end of Father Joseph's, followed by Saint Seraphim of Sarov's prophecy. So we have Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, and now I'm going to read these prophecies now. Just listen to it piously and with reverence, okay? Because I guess most of these prophecies need to be understood with reverence. It's not like a whoa, like really epic base. No, it should be these words are from the Holy Spirit, so it should be understood in a very reverent way. So Saint Lawrence says, the whole choir of Russian saints, together with the Mother of God, begs to spare and have mercy on Russia. Then he follows, Russia, together with all the Slavic nations and lands, will constitute a mighty tsardom, so a mighty kingdom. At its helm will be an Orthodox Tsar, anointed by God. The Tsar will be from God. All schisms and heresies will vanish in Russia. There will not be any persecution of the Orthodox Church. The Lord will have mercy on Holy Rus, because in her there had been terrible, terrible times preceding the Antichrist. The great regiment of martyrs and confessors who has shown forth, beginning of the highest spiritual and civil ranks, Metropolitan and Tsar, priest and monk, children and even nursing infants, ending of lay people. All these will beseech the Lord God, the King of hosts, the King of kings, glorified in the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So,
Amen, brother.
amen. St. Lawrence is telling us that, he's pretty much, and notice this is the first prophecy which pretty much speaks specifically about what will happen, and he speaks about a political order, about a geopolitical order as well, a unity of Slavic nations. I mean, kind of hard to imagine, especially after things, I mean, again, our imagination is fallible and human, and of course we're bound by the materialistic sinfulness of the world, but after things such as Yugoslavia, after the current, I mean, the two Slavic nation brothers fighting now, Ukraine and Russia, well, it's not that simple, but, on the ground level it may appear like that, but notice, he says, schisms, heresies will vanish, the persecution will cease, and St. Lawrence, during his time, the communist regime in the Soviet Union was still persecuting Orthodox Christians. So for this to be said out loud was a little bit far. Even priests would raise an eyebrow because, it's like, well, what are you talking about? Father Lawrence, how can the persecution suddenly just finish like that? Because we're in the middle of persecution now. But nevertheless, he has said these things. And then he mentioned, of course, that all the saints in heaven are praying for Holy Russia, and all the martyrs, all the confessors who've passed away in the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia at the hands of the communists, they're all in heaven asking God, begging him for mercy. And I think Conrad there's the fact that, look, he mentions monarchy. He mentions that all the Orthodox people will be united under an imperial monarchy, a Tsar, anointed by God. I mean, that's pretty amazing and very staggering.
Well, and I just want to say for anybody who's in our comments can be like, oh, this isn't biblical. Where is this in the Bible? Well, I think what he's saying is just the obvious biblical conclusion of James 5. I mean, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And no nation has more martyrs that have been recently, I guess you could say, made than Russia. So if the prayer of righteous man availeth much, and we have a cloud of witnesses, and we believe that the saints in heaven are praying for us, then it would only make sense that Russia would have what you might call a spiritual advantage when it comes to the time of Antichrist. I guess the real implication from this, and this is where we want to be a bit careful, is that it sounds that the Antichrist isn't that far away. Because, I mean, this is referencing Antichrist in the sense that the persecutions under the Soviets will still be like relevant in history, like this isn't necessarily 2,000 years from now. So I just think that's interesting. And when it comes to countries being... Actually, I'll get your thoughts on that first, Dimitri.
No, absolutely. I think, and it aligns with not just this prophecy in particular, but the next one we'll read, the final prophecy in this article by Father Joseph. Notice the prophecy does speak of, the Tsar coming, the kingdom, being led by Russia participating in it, and the fact that, the Antichrist will not, I guess, dominate the entire world completely. It's a very hopeful message. I'm just a little bit... I think at first when I read this prophecy about 10, 15 years ago, I was a little bit taken aback because I always had the idea that, well, the Antichrist will of course dominate the entire world and rule the entire, the whole world will be taken. It's quite a depressing message, and that Orthodox people should prepare for. I think in any case, Orthodox people should prepare for, if the end does come, to be under the rule of the Antichrist and to live in those sort of conditions. We shouldn't be too white-pilled about, oh, well, what if we end up in, say, the most based part of the nation, which will be independent from, the globalist world order that will be ruled out of Jerusalem by the king and high priest there, who I'm speaking about. I think it's good to just be prepared. There's a certain prepper, I'm not trying to mean, but there's a prepper mindset which goes into this.
I think for everyone curious to read more, I haven't actually read this book in its entirety. I've read a few chapters from it and watched some of the fantastic interviews with the author, Dr. G.M. Davies, on the Orthodox Ethos channel with Father Peter Heers. But he wrote a book, Antichrist, about globalization in our times and stuff. And he talks about a lot of the stuff we're talking about, even, and he himself even mentions that, we need to be prepared for it to maybe be closer than we think because, I mean, it's not just rumors. Many people say like they have a what many would call the third temple already pre-constructed, and and we hear all this from. They have a mock Sanhedrin now, and they even do fake animal sacrifices, preparing for perhaps future animal sacrifice on the Temple Mount.
Hmm.
Which we'll get into some of this other stuff when we transition away from these specific prophecies. But do you want to talk about Saint Seraphim, Dimitri?
Yeah, let's just mention the final prophecy by Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Now, Saint Seraphim of Sarov was a saint who predominantly lived in the 18th century, but passed away in 1833. So didn't live even up to, I guess, what a lot of Russians would consider the end of the Russian Empire. He lived essentially at its peak, when it was at its peak strength, when you had, people like great Admiral Ushakov was around, General Suvorov was around. You had, this is the reign of Empress Catherine the Great, and of course future Saint Paul, the Emperor of Russia. And Saint Seraphim was alive at this time, and this is the prophecy which he gives. He says, everything that bears the label of Decembrists or Decembrists.
Decembrists.
Yeah. Decembrists were essentially revolutionists. Now, let me just continue the prophecy. But yeah, reformers, and in a word, belongs to the party for the betterment of life, is genuinely anti-Christian, which in evolving will bring about the destruction of Christianity and in part of orthodoxy upon the earth, and which will finally end with the enthronement of the Antichrist over all the nations of the world except Russia. She will come together into a single united body with the other Slavic nations and comprise a huge ocean, one mighty realm, fearsome to the foes of Christ, before which all the tribes of the earth will quail in fear. And this is as sure as 2 plus 2 is 4.
That's pretty powerful. And regarding some of that, like Saint Seraphim is he's considered one of the most powerful saints of the last 500 years. He's a powerful intercessor. He was a very holy, big revival person who initiated revival of monasticism in Russia. And he was canonized by Tsar Nicholas II. And Dmitri has another interesting story about a trench that we're going to talk about it's relevant. But when it comes, we've talked a lot about the royal martyrs and how even those might be the enthroned women that were talked about in the prophecies of the other Saint Seraphim. Oh, we know, or if that was the other saint. Regardless, when Saint Seraphim was canonized by the Tsar during the reign of Emperor Nicholas II, before that he was visiting the monasteries and was already was venerating Seraphim before he was a saint and was preparing for his canonization. We're being a very a holy royal family, like in many ways at the time that the Russians had been doing in the past. It was a holy roost. This empire was an Orthodox empire, and at one point they came to the monastery and the nuns gave the Tsar on like a silver platter. They gave him this letter that had been preserved from Saint Seraphim by kind of his lay disciple Motovilov, who is one of the main reasons we have so many of the stories of Saint Seraphim. And the letter was delivered to the Tsar, and it's not known exactly what it is said, but Saint Seraphim had told them to give it to the Tsar that is to canonize him. And it said that after he read it, he was extremely upset and was in a state of depressed contemplation for a long time. And so it's understood largely by the church that it likely foretold his martyrdom.
Yeah, and not just that. I think not only would the letter have a prophecy in it, which, mind you, as Conrad just said, we don't know the contents of the letter that was given to Emperor Nicholas right at the end of his reign. Now notice that Saint Seraphim passed away in 1833, and Emperor Nicholas may only have received this letter in 1903 at the earliest, between 1903 and 1914. So notice it's been about 80 years, and this letter had a message to him specifically. And so the local nuns provided that letter, as Conrad said, to the emperor himself, and it was like a very powerful statement. Essentially, it's kind of like similar to some high schools. You have like people bury like a time capsule, in the dirt, and then you dig it up, and it has a message for the future. It's not like that exactly, but I guess that's a secular way of, I guess, passing on some sort of message about modern culture to the future. But here we have a literal prophecy for the future Tsar specifically, written by a saint who never knew him, who wasn't even born during his, he didn't they weren't contemporaries at all. And this letter, it was probably, and I'm speculating here, but just based on what the other church fathers in recent years have written, that well, this letter probably contained a prophecy, and it was a prophecy to the Tsar that look, the Russian Empire will fall, and you will be the final emperor, at least in this lineage, and that you will be martyred, you and your entire family will be killed, and you need to stay strong and hold fast to hold fast to the church tradition. It was probably something of that nature. Now, unfortunately, there are liberals, not exactly all of them Orthodox, but there are some who in the church they say, well, the letter must have said something like Tsar Nicholas needed to submit to the will of God and, of course, abandon his throne, which people believe he willingly did in February, March 1917, when the abdication occurred. Abdication in, inverted speech marks. Like, we're speaking about apparent abdication, which was signed by a pencil on a train when he was taken in custody without, I guess, yeah. So that's a different subject, but let's just say the liberals in the Russian church even used this prophetic letter which Saint Seraphim wrote to the Tsar as a sort of way to attack Orthodox monarchy. I guess conservatism by saying, well, Saint Seraphim must have just told the Tsar that it's time to transition into a democratic liberal Russia, which is not true. So I just want to give that disclaimer now. That's already been debunked, and there's no way that has any grounding behind it. Now, one of the reasons, I'm not going to go too much into a tangent, because the crowned empresses who the saints, the elders spoke about, the elder Aristocles of Moscow mentions the crowned, women praying for Britain. These women, of course, the nobility of Russia, the noble women from Germany and England would always once they became Orthodox, they would visit these Orthodox monasteries, and some of these monasteries were those set up by Saint Seraphim. So, for example, Diveyevo, it's one of the largest monasteries in Russia. It's about 4 or 5 hours drive outside of Moscow, so it's quite a long journey. But once you get there, it's just amazing view. So Diveyevo Monastery, it's a convent, which means it's a female monastery for nuns, and this monastery it's absolutely gorgeous. And Saint Seraphim, I guess I'm just going to mention the trench, the groove in the earth. It's like a Saint Seraphim during his life, while he was building this convent, he was mapping it out, and on one side of the convent, he took a plow and he plowed about 2 kilometers worth, just a line in the dirt. And of course, he said, at the end of the world, the Antichrist will not, when the Antichrist invades Russia, he will not go past this point here. This trench is one of the borders which the Antichrist will not cross, and he's going to retreat from here. And so, to this day, that trench exists, and the monks actually emphasized it by actually putting in more work into the earth, and so it looks like an actual rampart these days. But there is an actual rampart in this monastery 5 hours away from Moscow, which Orthodox people, it's in our tradition, we believe that when the Antichrist does come, this trench will be a line of defense against, the son of Satan himself. So this is like really deep, eschatological stuff here. And Saint Seraphim of Sarov, like, he is linked, of course, not just to Russian tradition, but of course all Orthodox people venerate him greatly. So this is not just a message to all Russian Orthodox people. This is a message to all Orthodox people around the world. Like, these saints need to be prayed to, they need to be respected. And notice his clairvoyant prophecy. Let's return to it here. He mentions, of course, that he mentions the modernists, the reformers, the Decembrists, right? He's speaking about the liberals, the Freemasons of his day. Again, liberalism today, we don't even, it's worse than Decembrists and reformers of Saint Seraphim's time. These liberals of today are like miles and multiplicities higher and more active and more degenerate than what I'm sure he saw in his time in the 19th century.
Oh, exactly. And before we kind of move out, that we've discussed most of the prophecies we want to talk about, and I want to bring up one more, and then Dimitri's going to kind of connect some of this to some of the big things going on in the more mainstream news society. I'm looking forward to that. But I just wanted to read from Saint Gabriel of Georgia, I mentioned earlier. He says something similar to Saint Seraphim. He says, Georgia will be enlightened in the end days. This will be revealed not materially, but spiritually. Believers from many countries will gather in Georgia. The wicked deeds started by communists are only a prologue. And St. Gabriel existed at the time in the Soviet Union and was actually institutionalized for burning a banner of Vladimir Lenin. And he goes on. The worst is ahead. The world has never witnessed such a sorrow from time immemorial. Georgia will be protected by the Holy Virgin, as Iveria, which means Georgia, is the country chosen by the Holy Mother of God as her lot. And so he talks about, and again, could Georgia could perhaps this connect with what Saint Seraphim and the other Saint Seraphim and the other saints are saying about Russia? Could they both perhaps be preserved? And we talked about Georgia being this kind of, at least the church being this sort of, bastion of true pan-orthodoxy. But at the same time, Georgia, the country we know, really struggles with influence from the West, and the church does its best to, protest pride parades and drive them out, but the secular authorities there are really going against that. But just to finish it out with St. Gabriel, he says the most important thing out of all this, which is a whole lot more important than any of the politics, is in the last days a man will be saved by love, humility, and kindness. Kindness will open the gates of heaven. Humility will lead one into heaven. A man whose heart is filled with love will see God. So I think that's always important to keep in perspective, is that all of these things are contingent on repentance and love. And, we could be blessed by the grace of God, and some of these horrible things could not come to pass through our prayer, or perhaps be pushed down the road, or some of even the good things that we've been told to hope for could be taken away from us. So I think it's important to always have that in perspective.
Yeah, amen. I think it's really important. Notice how we need to stay prayerful, no matter what the prophecies say, no matter how dire the predictions and how difficult the tribulations ahead of us, and no matter how bad the news, frankly, because we've said on many episodes, the media tends to accentuate and exaggerate the anxiety we face, and of course, I think it's very obvious, and even in modern times, for example, like certain, notice certain news comes out, like people speak their mind openly online, for example, and they get shut down. I think one of the great stories of the week, I think, is probably the famous African-American rapper Kanye West, how he essentially begins speaking his mind, of course not from an Orthodox perspective, but from a Protestant perspective, very valid opinion about certain, business folks and globalist communities which dominate discourse, and he's basically speaking out against folks who have apparently oppressed him. Now, this is not just your usual sort of claim of an African American that, the United States is a racist, white supremacist, sort of nation. But no, he's speaking about more of like an economic, sort of a cultural domination. The fact that, notice like a pharmaceutical dominion over his life. It's really, it's really been the news of the week. But how this relates to geopolitics is just the fact that, notice he gets completely isolated and taken down. All of his support, and he just says certain things about, certain communities and cultures, and all the frameworks of his life get completely dismantled. The banks close his accounts, his sponsors, it's sort of like a mark of the beast type system. Wouldn't you say, Conrad? Like, you don't take the mark, and this, you cannot purchase any food, you can't participate in the market, in the the marketplace of ideas. You're getting shut down, you get isolated, you get cancelled, like an Alex Jones. And like in one of my tweets, I mentioned the fact that, well, if Saint Joseph of Volotsk was still alive, he wouldn't have a Twitter account, he would be suspended. There are certain saints who've said such drastic things, like some of the prophecies we read today, that they simply would not be allowed to speak in a very censored world of today.
No, I mean, just read Adversus Judaeos from St. John Chrysostom. I mean, I think that's illegal in most of Europe, probably. But I think when it comes to what Kanye is saying and everything, Jonathan Peugeot, who we really enjoy, he had some good comments on this, that be sure, don't dismiss the fool. He puts Kanye as kind of fulfilling this fool archetype, who's very important in society, because the fool is free to mock who the others are not free to mock. The court jester is given permission perhaps to mock the king, and we're kind of seeing that Kanye perhaps doesn't so much have permission as he's sort of taking permission. But it's important to recognize, that he might be a bit of a performative person, and he might, have, be not be the, I think he's a decent communicator, but not the most amazing, concise, erudite communicator, but he is fulfilling this very important role that I think has actually been gone from modern society for so long, and is part of why we've been able to see such a narrative dominance from secular globalist forces.
Yeah, and like notice it's the same globalist forces who tend to support Ukraine no matter what. So again, geopolitically speaking, remember what is the current thing? The current thing was COVID. The current thing was shutting down Alex Jones, fining him. The current thing is now, Kanye is this really evil, bigoted man. But notice Kanye is just speaking his mind at the end of the day. He's just an example, and he's I mean, he's a Protestant Christian, but he's still a Christian. He still believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He believes in the Holy Trinity. Like, he does have, he doesn't follow the exact theology of the Nicene Creed or Orthodoxy, but he has these ideas. And notice how he's just being shut down mercilessly. Again, we spoke about love and the fact that um, all Christians should act of love, but these forces opposing, say, not just Kanye, but I guess conservatism and Christianity in the world, these forces aren't Christians, so they don't do things with love. It's usually like the same hatred we see online towards Russia today. It's like very infused, very it's violent, it's cruel, it's torturous. Has nothing to do with Christian tradition or I guess the Christian church tradition going back thousands of years. This is something completely different. It's almost like a completely different religion and probably related to whatever globalist project they have for the end of the world, frankly. This is a prototype of the Antichrist system of censorship, which I'm sure he will use on the aforementioned, forefather Enoch and the prophet Elijah when the end times come to kind of put a halt to their prophecies as well. So, and then I'm not comparing, of course, Kanye to a prophet Elijah, but the fact that someone like Kanye can't even speak his mind, and he's just a rapper. Like, he said some pretty crazy stuff in the past. Like, he's an African American musician. I'm sure he can be given some leeway to speak his mind, but apparently not. Apparently, what he's saying is completely absurd, and it's not allowed. It should be censored. I think that's it's worth paying attention to that sort of piece of news. And I guess if you're an Orthodox Christian, just watch what's happening to Kanye, and then apply that to a Christian saint. If Kanye was a Christian bishop saying these things, and the censorship was the same, how would you react to it? Well, for example, like, the things he's saying aren't exactly the most absurd. Take things, investigate, do your reading. Don't take things at face value. Definitely use your discretion. That's always advised. But again, if Kanye was an Orthodox Christian, would you support his sort of his censorship? Probably not. So I suppose yeah, that's kind of my message, is just to discernfully read these news and see how they apply to the world, because I think what we're seeing now with Kanye's censorship is an example of what is to come, at least for us conservative Orthodox Christians in the West, and not just Orthodox, but all Christians in the West.
Yeah, I mean, Kanye might not be Orthodox yet, but he has spoken positively of Putin. He's spoken positively of monasteries. His ex-wife, his children are baptized, Armenian Orthodox, at least some of them, which is about as close to true to real orthodoxy as you can get while still, being in the wrong church. But so he is aware of some of these things. He praised Putin for building monasteries and re-Christianizing Russia, which just, that fact alone is just so funny to us that we started the show and then Kanye's talking about this and then the war and everything. But in many ways, the people coming after Kanye, it's the exact same people that want you to support a war with Russia. And Kanye's also just blowing the lid off of, the whole, in many ways, MK Ultra handler control kind of stuff, where, I mean, he just showed his freaking personal trainer, who is clearly some kind of intelligence military operative, comes out of the Canadian military industrial complex and has every single famous person as a client. That man apparently feels he can just tell one of the richest black people in the world that he's just going to institutionalize him and take him from his kids. And that is, the Kanye was smart releasing that, because it doesn't matter how opinionated people might be on some of the other stuff he said. That crosses a line for anybody. So I do view this as a turning point in the public consciousness.
Yeah, I think the idea of psychological warfare, MK Ultra, like, this is real stuff. If you think MK Ultra and mind control is fake and not real, like, you are, I mean, from a Christian perspective, you are just straight up wrong. And yes, this has already been used on saints. I'm sure many of you are unaware, or maybe you are aware, of the confessors and martyrs of the Romanian Orthodox Church. So this is, of course, the land. Romania is a country in Central Europe. You may have heard of it because that's where, like, Andrew Tate lives, but no, it goes beyond just Andrew Tate. This is a country next to Hungary. It's a very ancient Orthodox land. Now, Romania, during the Soviet times, there were confessors and martyrs there, which were so the Soviets wanted to turn Romania from a Christian country into an atheist country. Now, how they did that was they captured monks and priests and they tortured them psychologically. It's probably some of the most, now I don't recommend exactly reading it, but I guess for perspective, you can read about some of the things which happened to these great Orthodox martyrs of the 20th century in Romanian camps. It's psychological in nature. They made Orthodox monks turn against their brothers, and they made the prisoners torture themselves and each other. through psychological means, essentially. So psych warfare is a real thing. And the other thing, of course, we remember this is not discussed much, but in the Soviet Union, especially towards the later end, when officially persecution ended in the late 50s, it persisted into the 60s, 70s, and 80s through a very subtle form, which even today isn't investigated much. There are a few PhD papers on this subject, but there was an idea that, well, if a person kept talking about orthodoxy, or someone just kept talking about prophecy and the things we spoke about on this podcast, frankly, if you mentioned this too much, or you were spreading pamphlets, or just talking about, if you're acting like a fool for Christ, like Jonathan Peugeot describes Kanye, you would be institutionalized in a psych ward and forever. So your consent would not be asked for. You would be put on meds for life for 20, 30, 40 years. Solzhenitsyn slightly writes about this in some of his works in the 90s, but I think the subject hasn't been explored much. There are many Orthodox people, and not just Orthodox, but libtard dissidents as well, and other anti-Soviet people who were institutionalized in Soviet psych wards and put on mind-altering medication throughout the Soviet Union, including Orthodox Russian priests. Okay, so the fact that we have this weirdo globalist handler, businessman type guy telling Kanye that, yeah, look, if you don't shut your mouth, we're going to institutionalize you. We're going to put you on meds. It's really hearkening. It really throws back to archipelago gulag, and like to these like primordial themes of wait a minute, this is like this is just torture. It's confessorship. It's essentially anti-Christian forces using these methods on Christian people to shut them up. Like this is happening in real terms, and there's a history to it too. Like, and so Orthodox Christian people, don't ignore the MK Ultra side of things. This has a real precedent. Unfortunately, we live in a world now where psychological technology is used against Christians, and we have literal saints who are victims of it. Okay, so it's not something that should be denied or dismissed.
I think it actually perfectly displays the differences between the two systems of Western and Eastern oppression of the 20th century. In the East, you had people locked in cells, and they ran speakers in there, and they tortured them, and they broke them down, and they just full hand force, blunt force trauma, like that level of interaction. Whereas in the West, they got us to do it all to ourselves. They through capitalism and business, they gave us a prosperous society, and then they told us that the worldview that gave us that prosperous society will also lead you, means you have to be happy. And so then you get, big pharma and all these sorts of things. And that's how you get the situation we're in now with Kanye, where you've already signed up so many of these institutions that can then reach out and grab you. In many ways, it's easier to spiritually resist if if your enemy is just stabbing you in front of you, as opposed to trying to convince you that it's actually the best and that everyone around you actually thinks it's good. It's in many ways it's 1984 versus Brave New World, and Brave New World has turned out to be a bit more of an accurate reflection of what we experience today. And it shows that how in many ways that communist persecution at the time was actually a blessing to these Orthodox nations, protecting it both from the creeping tide of liberalism where you slowly but surely just change your beliefs, and now blessed with thousands and hundreds of thousands of martyrs and confessors praying for them in heaven, protecting them from future persecutions.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we need to remember that no matter what, say, someone like Kanye faces, what we as in those who are, all of us who are Orthodox Christian, we should not be afraid of, say, these forces of the world coming upon us and harassing us and fighting us and just basically assaulting us with all kinds of these material means, because at the end of the day, and even spiritual means, frankly, because prayer, the sacraments, they do defeat all of these tools of the devil at the end of the day. And frankly, even if you face death and torture, what awaits you is the crown of martyrdom and confessorship at the end of your earthly road. So there's no need to despair at the end of all this. I mean, this is in the lives of martyrs. This is how the church came to be in the early centuries. All of the apostles faced violent and deaths not by their own hands, except Apostle St. John, the evangelist, whom we spoke about at the beginning of this episode. And just need to remember that we don't exactly have an easy road as Christians here on earth. And of course, I'm sure in the Islamic tradition, there's this own understanding of, facing your enemy and having tenacity and not being intimidated. But I guess we do face this common Dajjal in the West. And notice how even Kadyrov and all these Iranians, they have this common understanding. They're like, okay, this Western evil, which, as Conrad mentioned, slowly destroys our culture, it needs to be faced. Like, even if Muslims and Orthodox Christians do not agree, at least we agree in this one thing, that this Western, by Western, I don't even mean Westernism. Oh, it's Western and it's bad. No, it's just this globalist. I guess we call it what it is. A globalist Western liberalism is the particular tool of the devil at the moment, being used to dismantle conservative societies around the world, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Orthodox Christian, especially. Of course, these are all of these things are being destroyed. And I would even say Orthodox Jewish society needs to be very wary of exactly what liberalism can bring to them. So I think all these things need to be taken into account.
Well, maybe if Orthodox Jews can start to realize this from that political side, they can also start to then see who the true, Messiah is in some of these regards. Because we do believe that at some regard, like those Jews who reject Christ will be the main force of Antichrist. But before that happens, some of them will accept Christ because there will, because that'll be the end. Like that'll be where the line gets really drawn. So some of them, we need to pray that even our greatest enemies, we need to pray that they also convert. And I think this is a good. Unless you want to say one other thing, Dimitri, I think we're nearing the end here. So I just want to talk about a few things regarding the Black Sea, Ukraine, some politics, Nord Stream stuff. We'll talk about that for maybe 5-10 minutes and then land the plane. But anything else you wanted to say, Dimitri?
No, I think the prophecy angle, we can speak about it for hours, obviously, but it's just I guess this article by Father Joseph, Father Joe, you can read it on his Substack. So the article's title, if you just Google these words, Antichrist will reign everywhere except Russia. And it's a Substack article. The Substack name is movingtorussia.substack.com. You can give it a read there. It only takes about 5-6 minutes to read, but of course, it's a good one to bookmark because having read these sources in Russian, Father Joe's translation here is actually spot on, and he does provide citations and things. So the article is actually very good on the Substack. I would bookmark it for the future or even print it out because if the Substack goes down, you might want to have this on record. These prophecies are real; they are substantiated. So yeah, do keep a clear account of them.
Oh yeah, that's very true. And be sure to follow Father Joe's newsletter and some of the other stuff he does on Substack. And we're going to have Father Joe on actually next week. So if that doesn't happen, apologies for saying this. Some things could come up, but as of now, we're planning on doing that. And regardless, we will be interviewing Father Joe in the near future. So look forward to that. I'm very much looking forward to it. But to get into some of the last few things we got to talk about on this here podcast is some of the stuff with Russia. We know with Turkey, we really like to talk about Russia-Turkey on this show. The grain deal became very contentious. Russia pulled out of that grain deal that allowed certain Ukrainian ships to go to be marked as humanitarian food aid, to not be searched by Russian ships. Turkey was facilitating this as well, as they are the other main power on the Black Sea, with the Bosphorus and everything, which is so relevant to the current climate. But right now, Russia, they left it, and now they're getting back into it. And then Turkey kind of was really mad and even asserted that even if Russia wasn't in, they would still be protecting Ukrainian ships. So we're finally seeing some friction between what was otherwise a stalwart kind of alliance with Erdogan and Putin. But finally, as Metropolitan Neophytos said, as if overnight, the Russians and Turks will turn on each other. So it's like we might start to see something that could perhaps precipitate, or at least the type of conflict when it comes to control over the Black Sea that could precipitate a turn in Russo-Turkish relations.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it's important just to understand as well that Russians still have certain forces in Syria still there, but the only connection between the Syrian Russian forces and Russia itself is through the Bosphorus Strait. So all the infrastructure they built in Syria, in Damascus, in the port of Tartu, like all these connections that the Russians have to the Mediterranean, they all flow through Turkey. So Turkey, limiting Russian transport, for example, would have huge geopolitical implications on I guess Russian external foreign policy outlook in the future. If Russia ever wishes to return to Syria, to sort of rebuild and to invest, I mean. Yeah, and the grain deal, of course, it just shows Russia's approach to this point has been especially soft towards the Ukrainians. I think, and this is one of the bizarre things, the bridges over the Dnieper River are still active. The Ukrainians are still transporting vehicles, machinery, etc. Military, like not humanitarian and food, but especially military, like tanks are going over these bridges. The bridges are still there, they're still standing. Electricity until the last month has been completely untouched. Gas has still flown through the Russian pipes into the Ukrainian homes and military bases as well. So the Russians are really taking a very hands-off approach. Not hands-off, but I suppose like a soft approach, a very humanitarian way they're conducting this war. And special military operation in a very, I guess, a very Christian way in a sense. Like they're really giving the Ukrainians almost every opportunity to, at one point, sit down at a negotiations table, which frankly should have happened in April in Turkey, and communicate both of their opinions, and then of course sign a peace treaty. But it's just not happening. Zelensky, for whatever reason, like the madman that he is continuing with this lunacy. And now, of course, we're speaking about grain shipments being delayed, and these countries arguing over, say, food. Now, notice we're coming up to winter now, so yeah. What happens during the winter? Of course, famously, this we have images in our heads come up of like the Golodomor, and Ukraine right now is already having food shortages, gas shortage. There's issues because, of course, in the conflict, it's not like the gas and electricity is being intentionally destroyed. I mean, now it is, but it hasn't been for the entire year. It's that there will be actual, almost natural disaster-like implications on this territory that is in the conflict now. I think this will have huge rundown effects if this grain thing doesn't pan out as, say, I don't know, in the Ukrainian favor.
Oh, and it's one of those things where Erdogan is, very much flexing his muscles here because he knows that in some sense Russia needs to keep him on their side. But we talk about his time is coming up. He's got elections and he is not the favorite to win. So that, like, just do not underestimate how much the Turkish elections are going to shift the balance of power, because Turkey is the most powerful military in NATO besides the United States. So it's just one of the most relevant countries when it comes to literally our entire podcast, as well as just anybody's geopolitical analysis. And unless Dimitri has anything else he wants to say on Turkey, Erdogan, elections, maybe some prophecies about that, I want to briefly, at least, I would be remiss to not mention the Liz Truss phone stuff. So, you have anything you want to say, Dimitri?
No, I think it's important to move on to like Liz Truss and just exactly that whole conversation, which occurred. Of course, Russia again being very transparent in its sources and what kind of resources their spies are gathering in the West. And the SMS that Liz Truss sent, to Blinken right on the, was it like minutes after the Nord Stream 1 exploded, and she basically messaged Anthony Blinken telling him it's done. Okay, this is of course, this event we spoke about for weeks now. Finally, we have, I guess, a main suspect. It's like a murder mystery, an Arthur Conan Doyle novel, and now it's coming to the point of wait a minute, the murderer is kind of revealing himself. And yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, Conrad. Like, I think honestly, it's I don't know if there's any way to prosecute Liz Truss. I guess she's not really a powerful politician anymore in the British scene, but like I'm not sure, has she exposed herself? Have they gotten too cocky, shall we say?
Well, it's definitely a good look for the Brits that they got rid of that disaster. Not that they replaced her with anything better, but it's just I think her incompetence was showing through even before we realized that. So this is just a bit embarrassing for, I think, British statecraft as a whole. Not to say that I'm pro Winston Churchill, but like this is like at least he had political gifts. Like this is just like this stuff is just embarrassing. And I'll just frankly say it. This is how I would have told you it went down. You get the Brits to do it as close as you can to the Danes. You get the Danes to investigate it, and then they just cover up on the behalf of the Americans. And it was all done at the behest of the State Department. And if you had asked me before any of this came out how it went down, that probably wouldn't have been too far from what I would have told you. So I'll just say it. The Russians I think are completely right. I think their intelligence is totally accurate. Considering how chill they've been with certain things, I don't think they would come out with this randomly. You know what I'm like? This is just one of those things where they've clearly been putting a lot of effort into the Nord Stream thing, whereas the West has hoped the media would just forget about it because the real consequences are about economically controlling Europe. It's not even as much a PR thing, but the Russians are making sure that it stays in the public imagination, and that's important. They have done a pretty poor job on the info war, but this is good. Releasing this intelligence is good. Like if like Liz Truss is now like she should be more embarrassed than Zelensky. That's more embarrassing than anything Zelensky has done, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's an embarrassment not just to Liz Truss, but the entire NATO staff. The fact that if this operation was conducted under the auspices of NATO and within their sort of department of covert action, like why do you have the British Prime Minister sending SMS messages, or messages of any kind, frankly, about any covert operations, to like it's similar to the Hillary email scandal, where Hillary would just destroy the emails, like in her Gmail, just completely, destroy hard drives, etc., etc. Like, it's a little bit absurd. These people, these I guess these elites of not just British but I guess American elites, these people behind the scenes, they've gotten so outrageously arrogant that they just do things now almost in the open, even if this may have World War III implications. Like we're entering into like there's a hot war going on. The British are providing literal military weapons, and then you have the British Prime Minister herself tweeting it's done after like minutes after a terrorist act has been conducted. Like the level of that of audacity is completely like out of this world. It's incredible, and just the incompetence. Of course, this is far from Churchill level parliamentary tactics. This is just a really barbaric in a sense.
No, and it's, people wonder part of why I'm interested in non-Western politics is because it's just less of like, looks, a lot of politics is fake to a degree, but like, just even pretend, if you even have to, if you've ever had to research and pretend that some of this Western politics stuff is serious, you just know how tiresome it is because it's all fake. It's just none of it is. It's all this kind of crap, this kind of stuff that you don't figure out till way later, and then you realize you were just being lied to the whole time. And speaking of that kind of stuff, I want to hear your thoughts on perhaps some of this Kherson stuff in the south of Ukraine. We're hearing reports that they've evacuated, they haven't evacuated, the flag's up, the flag's down. What's kind of going on there,
No,
Dimitri?
so the evacuation is actually happening, but those who are choosing to stay behind, of course, there's the Russians are spreading the message that Kherson is a fortress. We are not abandoning it. And notice the difference. Like a friend of mine, we were just chatting actually last night about this whole situation where we're chatting about the difference between the evacuation that Ukrainians apparently conducted out of Mariupol, where they would, I mean, there was footage of Ukrainian as of neo Nazis just shooting. Like there was a car driving out of Mariupol, and they would just stop the car and just shoot the people in the car, the mother, the kids, everybody. Like they would just kill people who they assumed were Russian spies. These were just refugees evacuating Mariupol before the Russians surrounded it. So compare how the Kherson people are being evacuated to how the Azov folks evacuated Mariupol. In fact, the Azov and the Ukrainian military never even evacuated Mariupol. They simply kept the citizens there as meat shields. The Russians are not doing the same. The approach is different. Again, the approach is one of love. It's loving your neighbor. It's defending. I guess Russians don't do everything perfectly. Notice this mobilization. There was like huge admin issues on the back end, and even in the war itself, the conflict, the SMO is not going perfectly according to plan, or I guess anybody's plan, frankly. But notice that the Russians are still trying their best in order to conduct things in a very humane, peaceful, systemic fashion. Whereas on the Ukrainian end, we see obviously State Department funded, NATO trained, just barbarism. Essentially, it's just it's powerful in a brutish way. Like the Azov, they basically said, okay, all the citizens of Mariupol, no one's leaving, everybody sit at your homes, and like let the Russians sort out your evacuation. Like it was just rough. A lot of innocent people ended up dying. But in Kherson here, yes, the Russians are conducting basically a very well coordinated evacuation. The Russians are holding the line several kilometers out of Kherson, the city, as well, to protect, I guess, any civilians actually leaving. And of course, we had reports 2 weeks ago about the barges and the ships crossing rivers, getting bombed with civilians on board, of course, by Ukrainian missiles. And this stuff is really despicable. Of course, it's kind of harkens back to, let's say, World War II, like some of the Nazi and other atrocities which occurred, where civilians would get hurt. It's Zelensky's idea of like a total war is completely absurd, but he is pushing it to the furthest extent. Like obviously at the behest of the State Department and those dark forces behind the scenes, these globalist forces that are kind of influencing him to do this. But yeah, in terms of Kherson, I think it's going well. Consider all things considered, the Russians are prepared for a massive Ukrainian push. Hence, they're evacuating the city, because if the fighting enters into the urban territories, there could be a lot of civilians that would get hurt. So that's just based on what I've been reading. And the Russians are, they're the people of Kherson are now Russian citizens. Yes, they're still Malarussians, they're still Ukrainian, I guess you could say, ethnically, so to speak, but they are citizens of the Russian Federation, and the Russians need to defend their own, and so they're having planned evacuations, and they're ongoing now, so they're ready for a huge Ukrainian push.
Yeah, I think we're about wrapping up the conversation here, but I want to get your thoughts on one last thing, and this is big stuff. Is we already know that U.S. has admitted to having boots on the ground in Ukraine at this point. They're training people. They have actual soldiers. Russia has hinted that Ukraine may not exist anymore. There's been very much The negotiations have never possibly been in a worse place, and it may just be over for negotiations. So, Dimitri, I just want to know. We'll talk about this for 2 more minutes, maybe, and then end. Do you think that before Nativity or after Nativity, we will see the true face of the Russian mobilization?
I think, frankly, it'll probably occur after Nativity, after Christmas, and most likely when the snow begins to thaw. So we'll probably be looking at the, I guess you can say, stage three or phase three of the special military operation in autumn of next year. So after the snows have melted, I think the winter time will essentially cause a sort of stalemate. Like all the frontiers will be frozen. No one's going to cross any rivers, and of course there'll be a huge economic crisis, not just in Europe because everything will be cold and there's gas shortages because of Nord Stream 1 getting shut down, but in Ukraine itself, the lack of electricity, lack of gas, the grain issues, if those accentuate, there's going to be huge. There's going to be a humanitarian crisis, and it's nobody's fault except Zelensky's and his neo-Nazi libtard degenerate government. So let's just remember that at the end of the day. And yes, Russians have made mistakes throughout the SMO, but I believe that this winter will be a true test, and it's going to be more of a literal Cold War rather than a hot one.
Are you thinking maybe around the year anniversary of the SMO, we might see Phase 3 start? Would that perhaps be realistic?
Yeah, I think towards the end of winter, especially when the temperatures begin to rise, and then of course Ukraine will of course be in a much worse state than it is now. Nothing for the Ukrainians will improve. For the Russian side, it's just basically about holding the line and supplying those front lines. The mobilized troops as well, they're being trained in real time now. But can you imagine in 3 months' time, they're gonna know exactly how to operate on those in those particular terrains. They're gonna have their command structure completely in place. They're gonna be drilled according to whatever standard the Russian military currently has, and yeah, all the equipment will be in place. So I guess phase three will most likely occur, yeah, around February 22, February 24, and definitely in March, April. So probably between Christmas and Easter is, as you said, between Nativity and Pascha is when I think things will start to pick up again. But they will slow down soon. That's just my, I guess, prediction based on not just my opinion, but based on things that geopolitical analysts and folks on Twitter have posted. And I guess the contemporary, because look, contemporary news is mostly basically it's taken not just from mainstream media, but mostly through posts of people on the ground, through Telegram, through Twitter, through these WhatsApp platforms. Like that's where you get the real news about real time events. You don't receive it from Fox News, CNN, unfortunately, whichever other news system is popular in your country. It's mostly the stuff on the internet, the raw data, and yeah, it's telling me that yeah, we're gonna see something between Christmas and Easter next year, but soon it'll really slow down to a halt, especially towards the end of November.
Completely agree. That would be what I said as well. And I just think if anyone who is, on the opposite side of this than us perhaps has made it an hour and a half into this podcast, just stop holding your breath for a big Ukrainian counteroffensive because you're going to turn purple and die. So just prepare for, at best, a little bit of intense fighting on a held line and then some hunkering down for a bit. And then, like Dimitri said. So, yeah, with all of that, this was a big episode. We kind of did it in reverse. We hit you with the prophecies first, and then hit you with geopolitics at the end. But with all that being said, thank you all so much. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, World War Now. Subscribe to our Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. Like, comment. We respond to the comments, by the way. So make a Substack account, comment. We'll answer your questions. Eventually, I'm going to start Q&A Substack threads that we'll even answer live or just in the podcast and recordings. So yeah, follow us on Twitter at World War Now _. Follow me, Gnomrad. It's a gnome, a gnome. Yeah, follow Dimitri, O Canonist, and yeah, pray for peace, pray for repentance for the world, pray for unity in the church, and pray for us. We appreciate your prayers very, very much. So we need them. Everyone does. And yeah, anything you want to leave us with, Dimitri?
No, I think that's pretty much wraps it up. I just appreciate all the attention and feedback we've been receiving and the constructive criticism as well. Yeah, definitely leave good comments about how the show could be improved. Some of the recommendations on subjects you'd want to hear about as well, because we are planning to release even shorter episodes about, say, distinct subjects, for example, even historical ones, which of course lead to the current geopolitical and the political realities of the world. For example, we're planning to release an episode in the future, maybe a 45-minute segment about the Russian Revolution and our particular perspective of that event, because I guess it has shaped the world we live in today to some extent. And of course, we'll speak about things like the American Revolution, some of these more historical events, and perhaps we'll even bring on historical experts. So give us ideas about content. We may already have those ideas, but any of your perspectives that you'd want to give us, of course, provide them for Twitter in DMs and comments, and yeah, we'll definitely take them on board. Okay, so it's an open conversation. As much as your minds are open and you're using your discretion, so are we. So we wish you a blessed evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are, and have a nice week ahead of you.